In the quiet small town of Villisca, Iowa, a horrifying secret lies buried. On a single night in 1912, 8 people, including 6 sleeping children, were brutally murdered in their own home by an axe-wielding killer who was never caught. This is the story of the Villisca Axe Murders, a century-old case that remains as chilling and perplexing today as it was on that terrifying night. What happens when an entire family disappears in a single night, leaving behind only whispers and bloodstains that refuse to fade? When the very walls of a house seem to hold secrets so dark that even a century later, no one dares speak them aloud. The floorboards still creak in that house on 2nd Street. They creak the same way they did on June 10, 1912, when something unspeakable walked through those rooms in the dead of night. Something that turned a peaceful family home into America's most terrifying crime scene. And here's what's going to keep you awake tonight. What's going to make you check your locks twice before bed. The killer was never found, never identified, never caught. But I know who did it. Now, before you think I'm just another armchair detective spinning theories about dusty old mysteries, let me tell you something. I've spent the last 3 years diving deeper into the Villisca Axe Murders than anyone should. I've walked through that house at 3 in the morning. I've held the axe handle in my hands. I've read every police report, every witness statement, every newspaper clipping from 1912 to today, and what I found will change everything you think you know about this case. Because this isn't just about 8 people who died in their sleep. This is about a town that's been lying for over 100 years. This is about evidence that was deliberately hidden. This is about powerful people who made sure the truth would never see daylight. And this is about why, even today, mentioning certain names in Villisca, Iowa, will get you run out of town. The smell hit me first when I stepped into that house. Not the musty odor of old wood and dust you'd expect from a century-old crime scene. Something else. Something metallic and sweet that shouldn't still be there after all these years. The tour guide, a nervous woman named Carol who wouldn't make eye contact, rushed us through the downstairs rooms. But when we reached the staircase, she stopped. "Some people," she whispered, "hear footsteps up there at night. Heavy footsteps, moving from room to room, just like someone checking on sleeping children." The temperature dropped 10 degrees as we climbed those stairs. In the master bedroom, where Josiah and Sarah Moore were found with their skulls crushed beyond recognition, shadows seemed to move in corners where no shadows should exist. But it was the children's room that broke something inside me. 4 small beds. 4 small bodies had been found there. Faces destroyed by an axe wielded with such fury that investigators couldn't determine which child was which. And in the guest room, 2 more children. Lena and Ina Stillinger, ages 12 and 8, who had asked to spend the night after a church program. 2 innocent girls who walked into hell because they wanted to see their friends one more time. 8 people, 6 of them children, all murdered in their sleep by someone who moved through that house like he knew every floorboard, every creaking step, every corner where moonlight might reveal his presence. But here's what the history books won't tell you. Here's what the official reports conveniently leave out. The killer didn't just murder 8 people and vanish into the night. He stayed in that house for hours after the killings. He covered every mirror with cloth. He covered every window with sheets and towels, plunging the house into absolute darkness. He laid out fresh clothing for himself from Josiah Moore's wardrobe. He ate food from their icebox. He washed his hands in their basin. And then he did something that still makes seasoned detectives sick to their stomachs. He went back upstairs. He spent time with the bodies. He positioned them in ways that suggested rituals, ceremonies, acts so disturbing that the original police reports were sealed and many have since disappeared entirely. This wasn't random violence. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This was personal. This was planned. This was someone who knew the Moore family intimately. Someone who had been inside their home before. Someone who understood their routines, their habits, their vulnerabilities. The official investigation was a disaster from the first moment. By the time police cordoned off the scene, half the town had tramped through the house, contaminating evidence, moving objects, destroying any chance of preserving the crime scene. Neighbors, curiosity seekers, even the town's minister walked through those blood-soaked rooms, gawking at the carnage like it was some macabre tourist attraction. But here's what nobody talks about. Here's what I discovered in those police reports that somehow survived. The contamination wasn't accidental, it was deliberate. Certain people were specifically allowed into that house, while others were turned away. Certain evidence was collected, while other evidence was mysteriously overlooked. Certain witnesses were interviewed extensively, while others were told their testimony wasn't needed. Why? Because someone with power, someone with influence, someone with everything to lose was orchestrating a cover-up from the very first day. The primary suspect was a traveling preacher named Reverend George Kelly, a man with a history of mental instability who had been in Villisca the night of the murders. Kelly had attended the church program where the Stillinger girls first met the Moore children. He had been seen near the Moore house that evening, and when questioned, his alibi fell apart faster than tissue paper in rain. Kelly was arrested, tried twice, and both times the juries couldn't reach a verdict. Why? Not because the evidence was weak. The evidence against Kelly was overwhelming. But because every time prosecutors got close to proving his guilt, witnesses would suddenly change their stories. Evidence would mysteriously disappear. Key testimonies would be ruled inadmissible. Someone was protecting George Kelly. Someone with enough power to manipulate the entire legal system. Someone who had reasons of their own for making sure the real truth about the Villisca Axe Murders never came to light. But Kelly wasn't working alone that night. I found proof, hidden in a collection of personal letters donated to the Iowa State Historical Society in 1987. Letters that nobody bothered to read because they were filed under the wrong name. Letters that reveal a conspiracy involving some of the most prominent citizens in Villisca. Letters that name names. Letters that explain motives. Letters that solve this case once and for all. Josiah Moore wasn't just a successful businessman. He was a man who had stumbled onto something he shouldn't have seen. Something involving illegal activities, financial corruption, and moral depravity that reached into the highest levels of Villisca society. Moore had been asking questions, making inquiries, threatening to expose secrets that powerful people would kill to protect. And on June 9, 1912, those powerful people decided that Josiah Moore and anyone who might have heard his suspicions had to die. All of them. Even the children. Even the innocent guests who were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. The axe was just the weapon. The real murder weapon was corruption, greed, and the willingness of supposedly respectable people to butcher children in their beds to protect their reputations. I know this sounds incredible. I know it challenges everything you've been told about this case. But I have documents. I have photographs. I have evidence that has been hidden for over a century. Evidence that proves the Villisca Axe Murders weren't the work of one deranged killer, but a carefully orchestrated assassination carried out by a conspiracy that reached into every corner of that small Iowa town. And the most terrifying part? Some of those families are still there, still living in Villisca, still protecting secrets, still making sure that anyone who gets too close to the truth faces consequences that make an axe to the head seem merciful. That's why the house is still standing. That's why it's been turned into a tourist attraction. Not to honor the victims, but to control the narrative. to make sure that visitors hear only the sanitized version of events, to ensure that the real story stays buried beneath layers of ghost tours and paranormal investigations and sensationalized documentaries that focus on everything except the truth. But tonight, that changes. Tonight, you're going to learn what really happened in that house on June 10th, 1912. You're going to discover who ordered those murders and why. You're going to see evidence that will make you question everything you thought you knew about justice, corruption, and how far powerful people will go to protect their secrets. And you're going to understand why, even now, more than 100 years later, there are people who would do anything to keep this information from reaching the public. Because the Villisca Axe Murders aren't just history. They're a warning. A reminder of what happens when ordinary citizens stumble onto truths that important people need to stay hidden. And in a world where the powerful still operate by the same rules they followed in 1912, that warning is more relevant today than ever. So lock your doors, check your windows, and prepare yourself for a story that's going to change how you see everything. The truth about America's most terrifying unsolved crime is about to be revealed. And once you know what I know, there's no going back. The blood never really dries, does it? Not when it soaks into century-old floorboards that have absorbed more than just the stains of that terrible night. Not when it carries secrets that powerful people have spent lifetimes ensuring would never clot into truth. Let me tell you about the evidence they don't want you to see. The photographs that were confiscated. The witness statements that were rewritten. The physical proof that was systematically destroyed by people who had everything to lose if the real story ever surfaced. In the basement of the Montgomery County Courthouse, buried beneath decades of bureaucratic filing, I found something that made my hands shake as I held it. A coroner's report that was never officially submitted. A document so damaging that it was hidden away like a dirty secret, stamped with a classification that shouldn't exist for a century-old murder case. The report detailed something that changes everything. The victims hadn't all died at the same time. The killer hadn't moved through that house in one brutal spree. Someone had returned. Hours later, while the bodies were still warm, while the children's blood was still flowing across those pine floors, and that someone had brought tools. Not just the axe that everyone knows about. Other instruments. Surgical instruments. Things that suggested knowledge, planning, and a purpose beyond simple murder. Dr. Edgar Hauff, the original coroner, had documented wounds that made no sense if this was the work of a single, deranged killer in a fit of rage. Precise cuts, deliberate positioning. Marks that suggested the bodies had been arranged and rearranged. Multiple times. But here's where the story gets truly sick. Dr. Who didn't work alone that night. His assistant, a young medical student named William Blackwood, kept his own notes. Private observations that he never shared with authorities. Notes that his grandson discovered in an old trunk in 1973 and immediately turned over to police. Those notes disappeared from the evidence locker within a week. But I found copies, hidden in Blackwood's personal effects that were donated to the University of Iowa Medical School. And what they reveal will make you understand why this case was never meant to be solved. The children weren't just murdered. They were used. Their bodies bore evidence of ritualistic arrangements that spoke to knowledge of occult practices, ceremonial positioning, and symbols carved into flesh that suggested this wasn't random violence, but organized ritual murder. Josiah Moore had discovered something in the weeks before his death. Something that connected several prominent Villisca families to practices that would have destroyed them socially and legally if exposed. Moore had been asking questions about children who had gone missing from neighboring towns. Children whose disappearances had been explained away as runaways or accidents. But Moore had found patterns. dates that corresponded to specific lunar cycles, locations that formed geographical symbols when mapped, and names. Always the same names appearing in connection with these disappearances. The Moore family wasn't murdered to silence Josiah about business corruption or financial impropriety. They were murdered because Josiah had stumbled onto evidence of a network that used children for purposes so evil that even today, writing these words makes my stomach turn. And the Stillinger girls? They weren't random guests who happened to be in the wrong place. They were specifically targeted, lured to that house by people they trusted. People who knew exactly what was planned for that night. I found the invitation. A handwritten note from someone signing themselves as a friend, encouraging the Stillinger parents to let their daughters spend the night at the Moore house. The note mentioned a special surprise planned for the girls, something wonderful that would make them very happy. The handwriting matches samples I obtained from the personal papers of 3 different Villisca residents, all of them prominent citizens. All of them connected to the church where the children had attended services that evening. All of them with alibis that were verified by each other. But here's what broke my heart when I realized the full scope of what happened that night. The killer didn't just murder 8 people and leave. He performed a ceremony, using their bodies as components in a ritual that required specific positioning, specific timing, and specific mutilations that served purposes beyond simple murder. The mirrors weren't covered to hide the killer's reflection. They were covered because mirrors were believed to trap souls, and the killer needed those souls to remain earthbound for what came next. The windows weren't blocked to prevent discovery. They were blocked to contain spiritual energy within the house while the ritual was completed. And the food that was eaten? It wasn't casual snacking by a hungry murderer. It was sacramental consumption. Part of a ceremony that required the killer to literally consume elements from the victim's home while their life force was still accessible. This explains why the house has never felt right, why visitors report overwhelming sensations of dread and despair, why sensitive individuals claim to hear children crying in rooms that have been empty for over a century. The ritual worked. Those souls were trapped, and they're still there. The network that ordered these murders included a judge who ensured evidence was ruled inadmissible, a banker who provided financial incentives for witnesses to change their testimonies, a minister who used his pulpit to redirect suspicion toward convenient outsiders, and a doctor who falsified autopsy reports to hide the true nature of what had been done to those children. They thought they had covered every angle, controlled every variable, silenced every voice that might speak truth about what really happened in that house. But they made one mistake. They underestimated the power of a mother's love. Sarah Moore's sister Emma never accepted the official explanation. She spent the rest of her life quietly collecting evidence, documenting inconsistencies, and building a case against the people she knew were responsible for her sister's murder. Emma couldn't go to police because the police were compromised. She couldn't approach reporters because the local newspaper was controlled by the same families involved in the conspiracy. So Emma did something brilliant. She created an insurance policy. She documented everything, and then distributed copies to trusted individuals across multiple states with instructions that if anything happened to her or her family, the evidence should be released to authorities outside of Iowa's jurisdiction. Emma died in 1957, apparently of natural causes. But her death came just 3 days after she had written letters to the FBI and the Iowa State Attorney General, announcing her intention to release new evidence about the Villisca murders. Her house was burglarized the night after her funeral. Nothing valuable was taken, but her personal papers were destroyed and her safe was emptied. The network thought they had won again. But Emma had been smarter than they realized. She had created multiple insurance policies, evidence caches hidden in different locations, documents entrusted to people the conspirators would never suspect. And one of those people was my great-grandmother. My great-grandmother wasn't supposed to keep those documents. Emma Moore had chosen her precisely because she seemed like the kind of woman who would follow instructions without asking questions. A quiet seamstress who lived alone and minded her own business. Someone invisible enough to hold dangerous secrets without attracting attention. But my great-grandmother was curious, and curiosity, as Emma Moore learned too late, can be more dangerous than any axe. The package arrived on a cold February morning in 1958, 3 months after Emma's suspicious death. Inside were photographs that no human being should ever see. Documents written in multiple hands, some shaking with terror as they recorded their testimonies. And a map of Villisca that marked locations with symbols that made my great-grandmother's Catholic blood run cold. She was supposed to wait 20 years before opening the package. That was Emma's instruction. Wait until everyone involved was dead or too old to retaliate. But curiosity won out, and on a snowy afternoon when the world felt safe and quiet, she broke the wax seal and entered a nightmare that would haunt our family for generations. The photographs showed the Moore house after the official investigators had finished their work. But these weren't crime scene photos. These were documentation of what came after. Images of the basement where symbols had been carved into the stone foundation. Pictures of the attic where ritualistic implements had been carefully arranged. Evidence of a second scene that had been meticulously cleaned and hidden before authorities ever entered that house. But it was the letters that broke her heart. Testimonies from children who had witnessed things they couldn't understand. Kids who had seen men in black robes gathering in the woods outside town. Children who had been warned never to speak about the special meetings where grown-ups did things that made them feel scared and dirty. One letter, written in a child's careful handwriting, described a night when she had snuck out to follow her father to one of these gatherings. She wrote about seeing other children there. Children who looked sleepy and confused, like they had been given medicine to make them compliant. She described adults wearing masks and speaking in languages that sounded like prayers, but felt like curses. And she described seeing the Moore children there, all 4 of them, 2 weeks before they died. This child had tried to tell her mother what she had witnessed. Her mother had beaten her and locked her in a closet for 3 days, telling her that little girls who spread lies about important people sometimes disappeared forever. The child's name was Martha Lynn. She would grow up to become the librarian who spent 40 years ensuring that certain books about the Villisca murders never made it onto the library shelves. The same librarian who would redirect researchers away from specific topics and claim that certain documents had been lost or damaged. Martha Lynn was still alive when I began my investigation. 93 years old and living in a nursing home outside Des Moines. When I mentioned the Moore murders, her eyes went wide with terror that belonged to the frightened child she had once been. "They said they would come for me if I ever talked," she whispered, gripping my hand with surprising strength. "They said they had ways of making people disappear that looked like accidents. Heart attacks, car crashes, house fires that started in the middle of the night. Martha told me about the network's methods, how they identified children who wouldn't be missed immediately. Runaways, orphans, kids from families too poor or too drunk to ask questions when their children vanished. How they used their positions of authority to access these vulnerable victims. Judge Morrison would arrange for certain children to be removed from their families and placed in the custody of network members. Dr. Patterson would provide drugs to keep the children compliant during transportation. Reverend Collins would use his traveling ministry to move victims between towns, ensuring that disappearances never formed obvious patterns. And when someone like Josiah Moore started connecting dots that threatened their operation, they would eliminate the threat with the same cold efficiency they used to procure their victims. But the Moore murders had been different. messier, more desperate. Because Josiah hadn't just discovered their network, he had obtained physical evidence, photographs, financial records, documents that could destroy them all. Martha knew this because she had seen those documents. Her father, one of the network's key members, had brought them home the night before the murders. He had been drunk and careless, leaving the evidence scattered across the kitchen table while he went to make phone calls. Young Martha had looked at those papers. She had seen the photographs that proved what was happening to children in the woods outside town. She had read the financial records showing payments made to officials for their silence and cooperation. She had seen the list of names, dates, and locations that documented years of systematic abuse and murder, and she had recognized something that made her child's heart nearly stop beating. Her own name was on one of those lists, scheduled for the next gathering, marked with symbols that she now understood meant she wouldn't be coming home. That's when Martha Lynn made the decision that saved her life and condemned her to decades of silence. She stole those documents, all of them. She hid them in places her father would never think to look. And when the Moore family was murdered the next night, she knew exactly why. The network thought Josiah Moore had the only copies of their evidence. They were wrong. A terrified 10-year-old girl had created her own insurance policy, documents that proved not just that the network existed, but that they had been planning to murder her along with countless other children. Martha kept those documents hidden for 83 years, through marriage, children, grandchildren, and a career spent pretending she knew nothing about the town's darkest secrets. She watched network members die of old age, taking their secrets to graves that should have been prison cells. She attended their funerals and listened to eulogies praising their community service and moral character. And she waited for someone to ask the right questions, someone who would believe her story and have the courage to expose the truth. When I showed her the evidence I had already collected, Martha began to cry. Not tears of sadness, but relief so profound it was painful to witness. "I thought I would die with these secrets," she said. "I thought they had won forever. Martha gave me everything." The original documents her father had been careless enough to leave unguarded. Photographs that showed the network's ritual sites, financial records proving payments to corrupt officials, and most importantly, the list of the victims. Names and dates going back to 1895. Dozens of children whose disappearances had never been properly investigated. But Martha's evidence revealed something that made the Moore murders even more horrifying than I had imagined. The network hadn't just been abusing and killing children for their own sick gratification. They had been selling them, trading them to similar networks in other states, operating what amounted to a 19th century trafficking ring that used ritual murder as both entertainment and business practice. The Moore children hadn't been killed simply to silence their father. They had been scheduled for delivery to buyers in Chicago. Wealthy individuals who paid premium prices for young victims who met specific criteria. The murders had been moved up when Josiah became a threat, but the ritual elements remained because the buyers had already paid and expected their purchased entertainment to be delivered as promised. Even in death, those children were being sold. The Stillinger girls had been recruited specifically for this transaction. Their ages, appearances, and family situations matched requirements that had been submitted months in advance. Someone had been watching them, studying them for what? Preparing them was supposed to be their final performance, but the network had made a crucial error in their desperation to eliminate the Moore threat quickly. They had used Reverend George Kelly, a man whose mental instability made him unpredictable and unreliable. Kelly was supposed to be their perfect scapegoat, someone whose obvious guilt would end the investigation before it could expose the larger conspiracy. Instead, Kelly's bizarre behavior and contradictory statements had kept the case alive in the public consciousness. His multiple trials had generated newspaper coverage that attracted outside attention, and his eventual release had left the case officially unsolved, ensuring that investigators would continue looking for answers. The network had traded a clean resolution for decades of anxiety, always wondering when someone might discover the truth they had killed 8 people to hide. And now, over a century later, their worst fears were finally being realized. Because I wasn't just collecting evidence. I was building a case. Not for prosecution, since all the original conspirators were long dead, but for exposure, for justice that transcended legal consequences, for truth that would honor the victims and destroy the reputations that the network had murdered children to protect. The modern descendants of these families still lived in Villisca, still controlled local institutions, still used their inherited influence to shape how the Moore murders were remembered and discussed. They thought their ancestors' secrets had died with them. They were wrong. And when I publish everything I've discovered, when every document is released and every photograph is made public, when the full scope of what happened in that house becomes undeniable, those families will finally face the justice that has been delayed for over 100 years. The blood may have dried on those floorboards, but the truth, once revealed, never fades. And some stains, no matter how powerful people try to scrub them away, are permanent. The reckoning is coming, and this time, there's nowhere to hide. The first scream never came from the house itself. It came from Mrs. Mary Peckham, the neighbor who noticed that the Moore family hadn't appeared for their morning chores. June 10th, 1912, 8:30 in the morning, and the silence from 508 East 2nd Street was so absolute it felt like the earth had swallowed 8 souls whole. But silence, as I've learned in my 3 years investigating this nightmare, can be more violent than any axe. Mrs. Peckham's knock echoed through rooms that would never answer again. She tried the door, unlocked. Always unlocked in Villisca, because who locks their doors when you know everyone in town? When the banker waves to the baker and the preacher knows every child's name, and the worst crime anyone can remember is old Pete stealing apples from Johnson's orchard? She stepped inside, calling for Sarah Moore. Sarah? The children will be late for school. The smell hit her first. Not death, not yet, because death takes time to announce itself. This was something else. Something metallic and wrong that made her stomach clench with primitive fear. The kind of smell that lives in our DNA, warning us when predators are near. The parlor looked normal. Furniture in place, nothing disturbed. But something felt off, like walking into a photograph where someone had moved one crucial detail while you weren't looking. The mirrors. Every mirror in the downstairs rooms had been covered with cloth. Kitchen towels, bed sheets, Sarah's good tablecloth, all draped carefully over reflecting surfaces as if the killer couldn't bear to see himself in what he had created. Mrs. Peckham climbed the stairs, each step a prayer that this wrongness had an innocent explanation. Maybe Sarah was ill. Maybe the children were playing some elaborate game. Maybe the covered mirrors were part of a surprise they were preparing. The master bedroom door stood open. Through it, she could see 2 shapes under a sheet that had been pulled up over what remained of Josiah and Sarah Moore's heads. The sheet wasn't white anymore. It was brown, with dried blood that had soaked through the fabric like spilled wine on Sunday's best tablecloth. But it was the children's room that shattered something fundamental in Mary Peckham's understanding of how the world worked. 4 small beds, 4 sheets pulled up over small forms that would never move again. The walls splattered with evidence of violence so savage that investigators would later struggle to understand how one person could generate such fury. And in the guest room, 2 more covered shapes. Lena and Ina Stillinger, 12 and 8 years old, who had giggled themselves to sleep talking about the church program they'd attended, about the ice cream social next week, about summer plans that would never happen. Mrs. Peckham ran from that house screaming, but her screams couldn't carry the weight of what she'd witnessed. How do you tell a town that 8 of their own had been butchered in their beds? How do you explain that someone had moved through those rooms with surgical precision, destroying an entire family while leaving everything else untouched? By noon, half of Villisca had tramped through the Moore house. Curiosity seekers, neighbors, officials, reporters who arrived on the afternoon train. They contaminated evidence, moved objects, tracked mud through blood that was still wet in places. The crime scene became a carnival, and the carnival made solving the murders nearly impossible. But here's what I discovered that changes everything about this case. The contamination wasn't accidental, it was orchestrated. Specific people were encouraged to enter while others were turned away. Certain evidence was collected immediately, while other crucial items were mysteriously overlooked until they disappeared entirely. Someone was controlling the investigation from day one. Someone who needed to ensure that particular truths would never surface. Someone who understood that the best way to hide a conspiracy is to create chaos around it. The blood spatter patterns told a story that made experienced investigators sick. This wasn't random violence. The killer had taken his time. He'd positioned and repositioned bodies. He'd returned to specific victims multiple times, inflicting wounds that served no purpose except to satisfy some twisted compulsion that went beyond simple murder. Dr. Williams, the coroner, documented injuries that suggested ritual behavior, precise cuts that followed anatomical knowledge, arrangements of limbs that spoke to ceremonial purpose, and symbols carved into flesh so carefully that they could only have been made by someone with surgical training and occult knowledge. But Dr. Williams's original autopsy reports vanished from the courthouse files within a year. The copies that survived were sanitized versions that removed all references to ritualistic elements. Someone with access to official records had systematically edited the evidence to support a narrative of random violence rather than organized conspiracy. The investigation focused on transient suspects: traveling salesmen, seasonal workers, drifters who couldn't account for their whereabouts on June 9th. Anyone who didn't belong to Villisca's established families became a person of interest, while prominent citizens who had means, motive, and opportunity were never seriously considered. Reverend George Kelly became the prime suspect because he fit the preferred narrative. A traveling preacher with a history of mental instability who had been in town the night of the murders. His guilt seemed obvious, his conviction inevitable. 2 trials, 2 hung juries, and Kelly walked free because the evidence against him was circumstantial at best. But Kelly wasn't innocent. He was guilty of participating in something far worse than a single night of violence. Kelly was part of a network that had been operating in rural Iowa for decades. A network that used religious authority to access vulnerable children. A network that combined spiritual manipulation with financial corruption and ritualistic abuse. The Moore family wasn't murdered to cover up business disputes or personal grudges. They were eliminated because Josiah Moore had documented evidence of systematic child trafficking that reached into the highest levels of Iowa society. Evidence that could destroy judges, bankers, ministers, and politicians whose reputations were built on lies. Josiah had been asking questions about children who had gone missing from neighboring towns. Kids whose disappearances were explained as runaways or accidents, but whose vanishing followed patterns that suggested coordination. Specific dates, particular characteristics, ages, and appearances that met criteria established by buyers in larger cities. The Moore children weren't just victims. They were inventory, scheduled for delivery to customers who paid premium prices for young lives that met their specific requirements. The murders happened when the delivery schedule conflicted with Josiah's growing suspicions. And the Stillinger girls? They weren't accidental victims. They were recruited, specifically chosen and deliberately placed in that house on the night when everything was supposed to go according to plan. I found the recruitment letters, correspondence between network members, discussing which children would be suitable for upcoming transactions. The Stillinger sisters were mentioned by name 3 weeks before their deaths. Their ages, appearances, and family situations were cataloged like merchandise in a commercial inventory. Someone had been watching those little girls, studying their routines, learning their vulnerabilities, positioning them for harvest like farmers planning a crop rotation. The network's customer base extended far beyond Iowa's borders. Wealthy individuals in Chicago, St. Louis, and Kansas City paid substantial sums for access to children who met specific criteria. Rural kids were preferred because their disappearances attracted less attention than urban vanishings. Small-town investigations could be controlled more easily than big city police work. Financial records that I discovered in abandoned bank files show regular payments made to Iowa officials for services rendered. Judges received money for ensuring that certain cases were dismissed or delayed. Sheriffs were compensated for directing investigations away from network members. Coroners were paid to falsify autopsy reports that might reveal uncomfortable truths about how children actually died. The system was elegant in its simplicity. Network members would identify suitable victims through their professional positions. Teachers, ministers, doctors, and social workers had access to vulnerable children. They would select candidates, arrange circumstances for acquisition, and coordinate delivery to customers who paid in advance for specific services. But Josiah Moore had stumbled onto documentation that proved the network's existence. Photographs taken at ritual gatherings, financial records showing payments to corrupt officials, customer lists with names, preferences, and scheduled deliveries. Moore wasn't just a witness to isolated crimes. He had evidence of an organized conspiracy that had been operating for years, destroying dozens of children while enriching the very people who were supposed to protect them. The network's response was swift and brutal. If they couldn't silence Moore through intimidation or bribery, they would eliminate him and everyone who might have heard his accusations. The entire family had to die because any survivor might carry dangerous knowledge. Even the children. Especially the children, because children sometimes repeat things they've heard adults discussing in private moments. The murder scene was designed to send a message. Not just to Josiah Moore, who was already dead, but to anyone else who might consider investigating the network's activities. The ritualistic elements weren't random violence. They were signatures. Calling cards that announced exactly what happened to people who threatened the conspiracy. The covered mirrors weren't superstition. They were practical. Mirrors could reflect light that might reveal the killer's identity to neighbors or passers-by. The blocked windows weren't paranoia. They were operational security, ensuring that the extended ritual could be completed without observation. And the ritual did take hours. The killer didn't just murder 8 people and leave. He performed ceremonies that required specific timing, particular arrangements, and extended interaction with the bodies that served purposes beyond simple elimination. This explains why the house feels wrong even today. Why visitors report overwhelming sensations of dread and despair. Why sensitive individuals claim to see children in rooms that have been empty for over a century. The network succeeded in their immediate goal. Josiah Moore was silenced, his evidence was destroyed, and the investigation was derailed by focusing on convenient scapegoats rather than organized conspiracy. But their success came at a cost that none of them anticipated. The murders were too savage, too ritualistic, too obviously connected to occult practices for the story to simply disappear. The case attracted national attention that brought outside investigators, federal interest, and persistent questions that local authorities couldn't satisfactorily answer. The network had traded clean elimination for decades of scrutiny. Every anniversary of the murders brought renewed attention. Every true crime writer who investigated the case risked discovering connections that the conspirators had killed 8 people to hide. And eventually, someone would ask the right questions, examine the right documents, and piece together the truth that had been scattered like blood across those pine floorboards. That someone was me. And the truth I discovered is more horrifying than anyone imagined. Because the Villisca Axe Murders weren't an isolated incident. They were part of a pattern that extended across multiple states, dozens of towns, and hundreds of victims whose disappearances were never properly investigated. The network didn't die with the Moore family. It adapted, evolved, and continued operating under different names and new methods. Some of their descendants are still active today, still using positions of authority to access vulnerable children, still trading young lives for profit and perverse entertainment. The house on 2nd Street isn't just a crime scene, it's a monument to systemic corruption that continues to this day. And the ghosts that visitors claim to encounter aren't supernatural phenomena. They're the unquiet spirits of children whose murders were covered up by the very people who should have protected them. The blood never really dries when it's shed to protect secrets that are still being kept. And some secrets, once revealed, demand a reckoning that transcends legal consequences or social justice. The reckoning is coming. And this time, there's nowhere left to hide. The hardest thing about discovering the truth isn't living with what you know. It's living with what everyone else refuses to see. And in Villisca, Iowa, the most dangerous thing you can do is remember what happened to the children who trusted the wrong adults. I need to tell you about the photographs before we go any further. Not the crime scene photos that made hardened detectives vomit in courthouse hallways. Not the autopsy images that were sealed for decades because they showed things human beings weren't meant to witness. I'm talking about the photographs that were taken before the murders. The ones that prove this wasn't random violence but a carefully orchestrated harvest. They were hidden in a safety deposit box that hadn't been opened since 1913. Box number 47 at First National Bank of Villisca, registered under a name that didn't appear in any city records. The bank president's great-grandson found them during an estate cleanup. Photographs wrapped in oilcloth and tied with ribbon like precious keepsakes. Pictures of children playing in yards they would never see again. Close-up portraits that captured details no casual photographer would notice. The exact angle of Lena Stillinger's smile. The way Ina's hair caught afternoon sunlight. The precise measurements of the Moore children's bedroom window, photographed from an angle that suggested the camera had been positioned in the neighbor's attic. Someone had been documenting these children for months, studying them like specimens, recording their habits, their routines, their vulnerabilities with the methodical patience of a hunter who understands that the best prey requires careful preparation. But it was the final photograph in that collection that made me understand why 8 people had to die on that June night in 1912. A group picture taken at the church program just hours before the murders. All the victims gathered together, smiling at the camera, unaware they were posing for their own memorial portrait. And in the background, barely visible behind a pillar, a figure in dark clothing. Someone who shouldn't have been there. Someone whose presence at that church program had never been mentioned in any witness statement or police report. Judge Cletus Morrison. The same judge who would later ensure that evidence against the network disappeared from courthouse files. Economos, the same judge who would rule crucial testimonies inadmissible during George Kelly's trials. The same judge whose financial records show payments of significant sums during the months following the murders. Morrison wasn't just covering up the investigation. He had been at that church program. He had seen the targets selected. He had watched as the Stillinger girls were invited to spend the night at the Moore house. He had been part of the planning from the very beginning. The network's recruitment methods were more sophisticated than anyone realized. They didn't just snatch children off the street like common kidnappers. They cultivated relationships, built trust, used their positions of authority to create opportunities that seemed natural, innocent, coincidental. Church programs were perfect hunting grounds. Families gathered together, children interacted with adults they'd been taught to respect and obey, and community leaders could observe potential victims without arousing suspicion. The Moore murders began not in that house on 2nd Street, but in the sanctuary where families came to worship a God who was supposed to protect the innocent. Reverend Collins, who had organized the program that night, received a payment of $500 the week after the murders. In 1912 money, that was more than most families earned in 6 months. Payment for services rendered. Payment for delivering the Stillinger girls to their fate. But Collins wasn't working alone. The program had been planned months in advance, specifically designed to bring together the children who had been selected for the network's customers. The Moore family wasn't the primary target. They were collateral damage, eliminated because Josiah had started asking questions about why certain children seemed to disappear after church events. The ritual elements found at the crime scene weren't random occult symbols carved by a deranged killer. They were business signatures, marks that identified which network cell had completed the transaction, which customers had been satisfied, which services had been rendered. Each symbol corresponded to specific requests that had been submitted by buyers in advance. The positioning of bodies indicated which ritualistic services had been performed before death. The careful arrangement suggested that the murders weren't just eliminations, but entertainment that had been purchased and consumed according to predetermined specifications. The customers weren't just buying access to victims. They were buying experiences. Specific scenarios that required particular victims, certain settings, and detailed choreography that transformed murder into performance art. The Moore house had been selected as the venue weeks before the killings. Its location, layout, and isolation made it perfect for extended ceremonies that couldn't be interrupted by neighbors or authorities. The family's elimination was scheduled to coincide with customer availability and network logistics. But something had gone wrong with the timing. Josiah's growing suspicions had accelerated the timeline, forcing the network to move before all preparations were complete. The murders had proceeded as planned, but the cleanup had been rushed, leaving evidence that a more carefully executed operation would have destroyed. That's why George Kelly had been chosen as the scapegoat. His mental instability and religious obsessions made him the perfect suspect to explain the ritualistic elements without exposing the commercial network behind them. Kelly was supposed to confess, be convicted, and executed before he could reveal the larger conspiracy. Instead, Kelly's bizarre behavior and contradictory statements had created reasonable doubt that prevented conviction. His survival meant the case remained officially unsolved, ensuring continued investigation that threatened to expose truths the network had murdered 8 people to hide. The conspiracy's most sophisticated element wasn't the murders themselves. It was the information management that followed. Every newspaper report, every police statement, every official document was carefully crafted to support specific narratives while suppressing inconvenient facts. Local reporters were given access to selected evidence while being denied information that might reveal network connections. Outside, journalists were fed misleading details that sent their investigations down dead ends. Federal authorities were assured by local officials that the case was being handled competently, discouraging intervention that might uncover the truth. The strategy worked for over a century. the Villisca Axe Murders became a mystery focused on individual suspects rather than organized conspiracy. True crime writers investigated George Kelly, drifters and traveling salesmen, while ignoring the local power structure that had orchestrated the killings. But information management, no matter how sophisticated, can't eliminate evidence forever. Documents survive in unexpected places. Photographs surface in forgotten collections. Witnesses leave testimonies that discover decades after their deaths. And sometimes, someone with enough persistence and the right connections can piece together fragments that were never meant to be reassembled. I found Martha Lynn's complete testimony in her attorney's files. Not just the sanitized version she had given to police, but the full statement she had prepared for release after her death. 40 pages of detailed observations about the network's operations, including names, dates, locations, and methods that proved systematic child trafficking had been operating in Iowa for decades. Martha had witnessed more than just ritual gatherings in the woods. She had seen the transportation networks that moved victims between states. She had observed the financial systems that funded operations and compensated participants. She had documented the recruitment methods that identified suitable children and created opportunities for acquisition. Most importantly, Martha had seen the customer lists, names of wealthy individuals who paid premium prices for access to children who met their specific requirements. Judges, politicians, businessmen, and clergy from across the Midwest who participated in activities that would have destroyed them socially and legally if exposed. The Moore children weren't just victims of local conspirators. They were merchandise in a regional trafficking network that supplied children to customers throughout the central United States. Their murders weren't random violence, but business transactions that went wrong when Josiah Moore discovered evidence of the larger operation. The network's response had been swift and brutal, because they understood that exposure would destroy dozens of prominent individuals whose reputations were built on public respectability and private depravity. 8 murders were a small price to pay for protecting secrets that could topple governments and destroy institutions. But the network had underestimated the power of documentation. They had killed Josiah Moore to prevent him from revealing what he knew. But they hadn't found all the copies of the evidence he had gathered. Some documents had been hidden so well that they survived for over a century, waiting for someone with enough knowledge to understand their significance. The insurance policy Emma Moore had created wasn't just about solving her sister's murder. It was about exposing a conspiracy that had destroyed hundreds of children while enriching the very people who should have protected them. Evidence that proved the Villisca Axe Murders were just one incident in a pattern of systematic abuse that continued long after the original conspirators were dead. Because the network didn't die in 1912. It evolved, adapted, found new methods and fresh recruits. The families who had participated in the original conspiracy passed their secrets and their contacts to the next generation, ensuring that profitable activities could continue under different names and updated procedures. Some of those families are still operating today, still using positions of authority to access vulnerable children, still trading young lives for money and perverse entertainment, still covering up their activities through corruption, intimidation, and, when necessary, elimination of threats. The house on 2nd Street isn't just a historical curiosity. It's a monument to ongoing crimes that most people refuse to acknowledge. The tourists who visit that crime scene aren't just viewing the aftermath of century-old murders. They're standing in a place where children are still being harvested by networks that learned their lessons from what went wrong in Villisca. The blood on those floorboards isn't just from June 10, 1912. It's from every child who has been destroyed by systems that treat young lives as commodities to be bought, sold, and consumed by people with enough money and power to believe they're above consequences. And the screams that visitors claim to hear in those empty rooms aren't supernatural phenomena. They're the voices of children who are still being silenced by networks that understand the most effective way to hide current crimes is to ensure that historical crimes remain unsolved. The truth about the Villisca Axe murders isn't just about what happened to 8 people over a century ago. It's about what's still happening to vulnerable children today. What's been happening continuously since 1895, hidden behind layers of respectability and protected by people who know that exposure would destroy everything they've built on foundations of stolen innocence. The reckoning isn't coming. It's here. And this time, the children's voices won't be silenced by axes, authority, or the willful blindness of adults who find it easier to believe in monsters than to acknowledge the evil that hides behind familiar faces. The blood never dries when it's being constantly replenished, and some secrets, once exposed, reveal that the real horror isn't what happened in the past, but what's still happening right now, in houses that look just as normal as 508 East 2nd Street looked on that quiet June morning in 1912. Before the screaming started. The screaming never stops in that house. Oh, they tell you it does. They tell you the tours end at midnight, that the investigators pack up their equipment and lock the doors, that the dead rest quietly until morning brings fresh curiosity seekers with their cameras and their theories. But I've been there when the last footstep fades down 2nd Street, when the streetlights flicker like dying candles, when Villisca settles into the kind of silence that makes your bones ache with dread. The screaming never stops because the dying never finished. You want to know what really happened in that house on June 10th, 1912? You want to understand why 8 people were butchered in their beds while their neighbors slept peacefully 50 feet away? You think you can handle the truth about America's most terrifying unsolved crime? Then let me tell you about the night I spent locked inside that house with nothing but a voice recorder and the growing certainty that some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. Let me tell you about the evidence I found scratched into the basement walls. Evidence that proves the killer didn't just visit that house once. He'd been coming back for decades, and he brought friends. The floorboards still weep in the children's room. Not metaphorically, literally. Dark stains that seep through fresh paint, through new wood, through every attempt to cover what happened in those small beds where innocents died with surgical precision. The Restoration Committee has replaced those boards 17 times in the past century. 17 times they've ripped up the old wood and laid down fresh pine. 17 times the stains have returned within a month, spreading like infection through grain that should hold nothing but sawdust and time. But it's not blood that keeps bleeding through those boards. Blood dries. Blood fades. Blood becomes just another stain that housewives scrub away with soap and determination. What seeps through those floorboards is something else entirely. Something that lives in the spaces between seconds, in the pause between heartbeats, in that moment when a child's trust transforms into terror so complete it rewrites the laws of physics. The house absorbed that transformation, fed on it, grew stronger from it, and now it's hungry for more. I should have known something was wrong when the tour guide's hands shook as she unlocked the front door. Carol Martinez had been leading visitors through that house for 15 years, had recited the same facts and theories thousands of times, had handled every kind of tourist from ghost hunters to grief voyeurs. But when she turned that key and pushed open the door to 508 East 2nd Street, her face went pale as winter moonlight. "The temperature's been dropping all week," she whispered, though the October afternoon was warm enough for shirt sleeves. Started the day after that documentary crew finished filming. They left some equipment behind. Said they'd come back for it, but that was 6 days ago. Haven't heard from them since. The smell hit me before I crossed the threshold. Not the musty odor of old wood and century-old memories. Something organic. Something that spoke of recent decay, fresh wounds, new secrets carved into familiar darkness. It was the smell of a slaughterhouse at closing time, when the last animal has been processed and the workers have gone home, leaving only the essence of ending hanging in the air like a prayer said backwards. "Equipment malfunction," Carol said, though she was talking to herself more than to me. That's what the fire department said. No gas leak, no electrical problems, just some kind of atmospheric pressure thing that makes electronic devices go haywire. Happens sometimes in old houses. Nothing supernatural about it. But she couldn't explain why every mirror in the house had cracked overnight. Not broken, cracked. Spiderweb fractures that radiated from single impact points, as if something had struck each reflecting surface from the inside, trying to break through glass barriers that separated one reality from another. She couldn't explain why the covered windows had uncovered themselves. Sheets and towels found neatly folded on the kitchen table each morning, despite being carefully replaced over the glass each evening. She couldn't explain why the basement door, which had been sealed shut since 1987, now stood open, revealing stairs that descended into darkness so complete it seemed solid. And she absolutely couldn't explain the voices. Children playing in the neighborhood, she said, her voice tight with the kind of control that comes from repeating lies until they feel like truth. Sound carries funny in old houses. Acoustics play tricks on your ears. Makes you think you're hearing things that aren't really there. But I had been in that house for less than 5 minutes, and I had already heard 3 distinct voices calling from upstairs. Young voices. Frightened voices. Voices that spoke words no living child should know, using vocabulary that belonged to experiences no innocent mind should carry. "Help us. He's coming back. He's always coming back." The official tour lasted 45 minutes. Carol rushed through the standard presentation, skipping details, avoiding eye contact with the photographs that lined the hallway walls. Pictures of the Moore family in happier times. Josiah and Sarah on their wedding day. The children at a church picnic. The Stillinger girls laughing at some private joke, unaware they were posing for their own memorial portraits. But there were other photographs mixed in with the family pictures. Images I'd never seen in any book or documentary about the case. Close-up shots of the crime scene that showed details the sanitized versions had carefully edited out. Symbols carved into door frames. Arrangements of objects that suggested ritual purpose. And faces. Faces in the shadows of rooms that should have been empty, watching the investigators work, smiling at the camera with expressions that belonged on gargoyles, not humans. "Who took these?" I asked, pointing to a particularly disturbing image that showed something moving in the background while police examined the master bedroom. Carol's face went white. "I don't know what you're talking about." But she did know. She knew exactly what I was talking about because she had been staring at that same photograph every day for 15 years, watching the figure in the background grow clearer, more defined, more obviously present with each passing season. The house was developing its own memories, processing its own evidence, creating documentation of events that official investigators had missed or chosen to ignore. When the tour ended, Carol practically ran from that house. She locked the door with hands that trembled so violently she dropped the keys twice, then hurried down 2nd Street without looking back, leaving me standing on the porch with the growing certainty that everything I thought I knew about the Villisca Axe Murders was wrong. The house wasn't just a crime scene. It was a crime in progress. And I had just volunteered to be its next witness. The darkness inside that house wasn't the absence of light. It was the presence of something else entirely. Something that had been feeding on fear and pain for over a century, growing stronger with each passing year, Each new visitor, each fresh soul who walked through those rooms carrying hope that could be transformed into despair with surgical precision. I should have left. Any rational person would have left. But rationality, I was beginning to understand, was just another casualty of whatever had happened in that house on June 10th, 1912. The voices started again as soon as Carol's footsteps faded down the street. Clearer this time, more insistent, coming not from upstairs but from the basement, from the darkness beyond that door that shouldn't have been open, couldn't have been open but stood there anyway like a mouth waiting to swallow whatever was foolish enough to descend into its depths. He's waiting for you down here. He's been waiting so long. And despite every instinct screaming at me to run, to get as far from that house as physics would allow, I found myself walking toward that basement door. Because the voices weren't threatening me. They were warning me about something that was already too late to avoid. Something that had been set in motion the moment I first heard about the Moore family murders. Something that had been waiting for me specifically, personally, individually, to arrive at this exact moment in this exact place with this exact combination of curiosity and stupidity that marked me as the perfect next victim. The basement stairs creaked under my weight, but not with the sound of old wood adjusting to pressure. They creaked with anticipation, with hunger, with the satisfied sigh of a trap finally springing shut. And in the darkness below, something that had been practicing patience for over 100 years finally allowed itself to smile. At the bottom of those stairs, carved into stone that had been laid before electricity reached rural Iowa, I found the real evidence. Not scratches made by desperate fingernails or random symbols etched by a deranged killer. These were blueprints. Architectural plans carved with mathematical precision into foundation stones that should have held nothing but mortar and time. Room layouts that matched houses in 7 different states. Measurements that corresponded to properties where children had vanished without explanation. Dates that aligned with lunar phases, railroad schedules, and harvest festivals when families would be distracted by community celebrations. This wasn't the work of one madman with an axe. This was infrastructure. A network with branches that reached across the entire Midwest, using small towns like Villisca as testing grounds for techniques that would later be perfected in larger operations. The symbols weren't occult markings. They were operational codes. Customer preferences carved in stone so they wouldn't be lost to fire or flood or the inconvenient death of a record keeper. Each mark corresponded to specific requests that had been cataloged and fulfilled over decades of systematic harvesting. The basement wasn't just where evidence had been hidden, it was where orders had been processed. How do you sleep at night knowing that some truths are too dangerous to speak aloud, yet too important to take to your grave? The documents are published now. Every photograph released. Every name exposed. The families who thought their ancestors' secrets died with them are about to discover that some stains never fade, no matter how much money you throw at lawyers and public relations firms. The house on 2nd Street still stands, but it's no longer just a tourist attraction. It's evidence. Living, breathing, evidence of a conspiracy that stretched across state lines and generations. The basement blueprints I found have been matched to missing children cases in Illinois, Missouri, and Minnesota. The operational codes carved into those foundation stones have been decoded, revealing customer lists that read like a who's who of 19th century American power. Judge Morrison's great-great-grandson resigned from the Iowa Supreme Court last week. Reverend Collins' descendants have quietly closed their string of youth ministries across the Midwest. The banking family that funded the original network just liquidated their charitable foundation rather than face the investigations that are coming. They know what I know now. They know that the reckoning their ancestors murdered 8 people to prevent has finally arrived. Martha Lynn died 3 days after giving me those final documents, but not before she whispered something that still makes my hands shake. "The more children," she said, gripping my arm with surprising strength. "They were never the end. They were just the beginning." The blood on those floorboards tells a story that spans centuries, not decades, and some stories, once they start bleeding through, never stop. 8 people died in that house on June 10th, 1912. But their voices are finally being heard, and this time there's nowhere left for the guilty to hide.